Hi, my name is Jack Goldstone. I'm a political scientist at George Mason University. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Revolution Support. Golden Kumquat asks, what is the difference between a rebellion, a revolution, and a civil war? Very few people are proud to say they've started a civil war or rebellion. But lots of people love to say, I started a revolution. Civil wars, rebellions, they're often part of revolutionary struggles, but by themselves, they're just violent episodes. It's the effort to change things for the better that makes a revolution special. Philip is asking, it's a little-known fact, but did you know the French Revolution was largely about baguettes? Well, Philip means that humorously, no doubt, but he is right that the French Revolution was largely about the price of bread. Shortages of grain and escalating bread prices are one of the main factors that brought French people into the streets of Paris. And this has been really true of revolutions throughout history. We have seen price spikes as an important factor in the Arab uprisings, where bread prices reached among their highest level in the early 20th century. Indeed, governments around the world worry about escalating grain prices because they do know that revolutions often start with the price of bread. L Spiral asks, is Nepal having a revolution right now? Yes, Nepal is having a revolution. One of these Gen Z revolutions have forced the ruler to flee, and a new ruler has been put in place with a mandate to create a more constitutional and accountable government. The reason young people are spearheading revolutions in places like Nepal is that they are fed up. Young people are protesting against the lack of basic services, electricity being shut off for hours every day, absence of things like fresh water. They know that there are better options available, and they're angry at governments that have been enriching themselves while doing nothing for the population. Chris Holt 1 says, who do you think has been the most significant figure in China since the Xinhai Revolution of 1911? My cat, Mao. The hero of the Xinhai Revolution was Sun Yat-sen. Several decades later, Mao came as the head of the Communist Party and created modern communist China and wanted to destroy anything in China that didn't conform to his communist vision. So Mao is the creator of the modern Chinese communist state. But for me, the most important person in China since the Xinhai Revolution is Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, the creator of China's modern economy. He encouraged cities to sponsor local industries. He encouraged farmers to improve their efficiency and farm for markets. The reason that China today is the second largest economy in the world is because of Deng Xiaoping. He set the framework for China's economy to grow, and that, I think, is what really changed China's place in the world. Jack C1126, are there any revolutions that are mostly considered to have been bad? Revolutions are the creation of human beings, and human beings are both virtuous and flawed. However, there may be some agreement that one of the worst revolutions was the Khmer Rouge Revolution in Cambodia. That's where the communist dictator Pol Pot seized power, and he unleashed a terrible reign of terror, really going after anyone who had any kind of relation to the Western imperialist world. The Khmer Rouge killed maybe 1 in 4 people in Cambodia during their short reign. But other people point to the millions of people killed by Stalin or Mao's famine. There are a number of competitors for that title of worst revolution ever. Stalin's revolution strengthened the Soviet Union to withstand Germany's invasion and helped defeat Nazism. And Mao's horrible famines were followed by China becoming the world's second strongest economic power. So again, revolutions have to be assessed carefully, separate the good and the bad. That's probably up to the people of each country to decide how they look at their own past. 5 Pugnito asks a challenging question. What is the oldest recorded revolution? We have records from the end of the Old Kingdom in ancient Pharaonic Egypt that seem to say there was something like a revolution that brought down the last pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom. Ordinary people were dressing themselves up in finery. The rich were reduced to wearing rags, and there was disorder and a change in rule. It does seem that the rule of the pharaohs was ended for a while and replaced by some kind of council of new rulers. That goes back over 4,000 years. But if you want to ask what is the oldest revolution of which we have a clear, unambiguous record, that would be the founding of the Roman Republic in 509 BC. Rome was ruled for most of the 6th century by a series of Tarquin kings. The kings got more and more tyrannical, and in 509, there was an uprising. We call it a revolution because the Romans didn't just put their own king in the place of the foreign ruler. They created an entirely new government, the Roman Republic, led by senators and tribunes of the people. The first real republic in Europe remained the model for city republics. Nessa Solar Guy asks, are today's conditions in the U.S. similar to any historic revolutions? Yes, to a surprising degree. A lot of the MAGA followers claim that they're having a revolution, that they're going to transform America's government. They want to create an America in which the president is the all-powerful embodiment of the national will, and in which the government ceases to be this large, protected organization. We talk about checks and balances to prevent any single person from gaining excessive power. The institutions that we've had have largely failed for a lot of Americans. I'm quite sympathetic to that. It turns out that if you look at the real wages of non-college educated men, they've fallen over the last 40 years. And so it's understandable that people feel they're being left behind. During the COVID crisis, it seemed like the government couldn't speak with one voice. 1 million people died. And so again, people felt the government's not protecting us. So many people have just come to believe that America's democracy is just serving a small, corrupt elite and is not looking out for ordinary American men and women. Now, that is exactly the belief that gives rise to revolutionary situations. So it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing people mobilize against the government, calling for it to be dismantled, calling for Democrats to be seen as enemies, or for Democrats to say that Republicans are trying to dismantle and overthrow the government. We're not in a revolution yet. That is to say, I don't think America's political institutions have been completely or permanently changed. But we're very much in a revolutionary situation. A question from the Anarchy 101 subreddit, can there be a revolution without violence? Yes, there can. Nonviolent revolutions have become much more common in the last quarter century. They need to persuade military officers and soldiers that the revolutionaries are a more virtuous group representing the country, while the government that they are sworn to defend is actually a threat to the country and is really in it for itself. The key is persuading the military to support the revolution. So yes, nonviolent protests can succeed. That said, it's hard to have a purely nonviolent revolution, simply because human nature is such that once emotions get stirred, some people are likely to turn to throwing bricks or even burning government buildings. And of course, if government troops fire on crowds, you're going to have some deaths as well. What's really critical is whether that violence overwhelms the peaceful protest. Often, if the violence becomes dominant, that discredits the revolutionaries, and the military may feel more impelled to defend the government. So it's a bit of a delicate balance, and one of the tasks that nonviolent revolutions face is keeping to the nonviolent path. Ape and/or goblin, where do you think the next world historic revolution will happen? I think Brazil. The reconstituted party there is doing really stupendous work. I don't think Brazil will be the next world-changing revolution for the same reason that the American Revolution wasn't world-changing. That is, Brazil is not centrally positioned right now in the world's global economy or politics. If there's a world-changing revolution, I think it's going to come in China, which is the last great communist power. Xi Jinping is leading a country that's running into economic and demographic problems. The economy is weakening, growth is slowing, people are hardly having children, and that means China's workforce is going to decline quite a lot in the next 20 or 30 years. So the combination of an increasingly kind of autocratic one-man rule and an economy that is faltering and where people don't have faith in the future, that's a combination that has often led to revolutionary rebellion. Sometime in the next 10 years, it's possible that the Chinese people will ask for a more accountable, a more democratic government. And if that happens, that would have probably the greatest implications for the world of any revolution since the Chinese Revolution in 1949. For a mod asks, did anyone else remember Che Guevara shirts being big in the mid-2000s? Che became a symbol of revolution in the 50s and 60s because at that time, Fidel Castro, who had created a communist revolution in Cuba, was promoting his revolution as doing wonderful and great things. And because there was no outside news to really counter that view, he was able to kind of cultivate an image that the Cuban Revolution had stood up against the imperialist Yankees in America, had gotten rid of poverty and prostitution, that it had spread healthcare and education. Some of that was true, but the economy didn't do well under Castro. In fact, Cuba, which had been the most advanced economy in Latin America, started to fall behind. So Che Guevara, who had been one of Castro's leading lieutenants, and was a great proselytizer for the virtues of the Cuban Revolution, became the face of the Cuban Revolution, along with Fidel. T-shirts with Fidel and with Che became common among college students in the 1960s because they were saying, hey, we also want freedom, and we think Che is a symbol of how we fight against capitalism and imperialism. Blacksmith Most asks, is the Haitian Revolution really the first successful slave rebellion? What about the Mamelukes in Egypt? Well, that question shows a good knowledge of history. The Mamelukes were slaves, but slavery in the ancient world didn't mean the same thing as African-American plantation slavery. In the Ottoman Empire, slaves could be prime ministers, skilled engineers, provincial governors. What made them slaves is they remained totally the property and totally loyal to the Sultan. Now, the Mamluks were military slaves put in charge of the Egyptian province under the Sultan, and they rose up and created an independent Mamluk dynasty in Egypt. The Haitian Revolution was the first modern slave rebellion in which African plantation slaves rose up against their masters. And it was a really incredibly influential event. People are starting to look at the Haitian Revolution and say, along with the American and the French Revolution, all three of these were really big pivotal events in world history. The Haitian Revolution helped spur the abolitionist movement in Europe. It showed that former slaves, like Toussaint Louverture, could lead armies, could lead countries. And so the Haitian Revolution gave new dignity and new respect among slaves and kicked off the discussion across Europe about what should the relationship be between slavery and democratic government. Yoda Jiva poses this question: do all revolutions need a figurehead? I have to say, revolutions need a leader. They need someone to inspire people to leave their ordinary day-to-day lives and join protests, to take risks opposing a government. Sometimes the leader can just be a quiet and powerful figure. George Washington was known for his humble leadership, his virtue, and his efforts to be a leader that everyone could follow. In other cases, you have revolutionary leaders like Mao who try and inspire divisions. So there are a number of different ways to lead a revolution, but you don't get very far without leaders who can galvanize people, maintain mobilization, and then build a new government. Bothrops asks, why is the French Revolution considered the main catalyst for global democracy and not the American Revolution? Americans always like to say it was our revolution that started global democracy, but the French like to say, but our revolution transformed all of Europe. The American Revolution started with a list of grievances against the British King George III and blamed him for being a tyrant. Still, the American revolutionaries were very aware that by getting rid of a monarchy and its viceroys, they were embarked on a new path. They were creating citizen government in which all the rulers would not have legal privileges, all citizens were equal before the law, and where even the highest officials were accountable to elections by the people. And that was something new. So the Americans knew they were doing something different, but let's face it, in 1776, America was a relatively small group of colonies on the far edge of European civilization. Now, France, that was the big power in Europe. Culturally, politically, militarily, French language was spoken all the way from Paris to Moscow. And when France had a revolution and the king and queen of France were paraded to the guillotine, that couldn't be ignored in Europe. Everyone had to sit up and say, wow, even the greatest sun monarchy in Europe can be overthrown and replaced by a citizen republic. Certainly it had its roots and influence in the American Revolution, but you have to say the French Revolution had a much bigger impact all across Europe than the America's colonial war for independence. A Quora user is asking, why aren't Venezuelans revolting right now? They have no food, electricity, water. People have started revolutions for less. Well, it's certainly true that people have started revolutions for less. In fact, one of the paradoxes of revolutions is that in many cases, revolutions start when things are getting better rather than when they are at their worst. In order to overthrow a government, people have to come together, they have to organize, elites have to turn against the regime. When people are really desperate and impoverished, it's hard to sustain a protest. For most of the people in Venezuela, survival has become so difficult that they are simply leaving in droves. Millions of Venezuelans have fled to Colombia or have sought to enter the United States. And for its part, the government in Venezuela is all too aware that it is hated by the people. So what the government has done in order to assure the loyalty of the military is it has engaged the military in narcotics trafficking and other illegal activities. This essentially forces the military to remain loyal to the government. Now, it's still possible that the bulk of ordinary soldiers might refuse to follow orders. They might engage in protest, joining the population. That's how revolutions have often started in the past. But at the moment, the military leadership is all too aware that they need to keep their troops loyal. So they are trying to give privileges to Venezuelan soldiers, helping them share in the fruits of these illegal activities, and that way protect their loyalty. Now, the question may come up, is there a breaking point? Can Venezuela become so impoverished that the government can no longer support itself? I do think at some point in the future, we'll see ordinary soldiers joining popular protests, and the Maduro dictatorship may come to an end. Independent Fact 082. Hey, no taxation without representation, but what representation did the colonists want? The colonists wanted the same rights as other Englishmen. Every borough and province in England had some claim to be represented in the British Parliament, and no taxes could be levied throughout Britain without the consent of Parliament. But the British colonists in America didn't have that. They had no representation in the British Parliament, and so the British monarchy felt they could levy whatever taxes they wished. The colonists had no say. And so the colonists said, hey, we want to have representation. We want our people to be able to vote just like other British citizens. And when King George said, no, you guys are far away, you're colonists, we know what's better for you, that started the colonies down the road toward revolution. They didn't want to go there, but they really felt that eventually Britain gave them no choice. They said, we're being treated not like free people who can control their own destiny, but just like subjects of an empire. And that's why the rhetoric of the American Revolution started to become, give me liberty or give me death. So that's the representation story. And that's why people in the U.S. value their representation so very much to this day. J.C. Dixon Can asks, did the Glorious Revolution kickstart England's imperial age? If so, why? England had one of the great empires in world history. As they said, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Where did that all begin? In 1640, England had a Puritan revolution. The king was tried for treason, beheaded, and a Commonwealth government under Oliver Cromwell took power, and in a series of wars defeated the Dutch and made Britain the leading power on the high seas. Cromwell also took out his anger on Ireland. Not only did he defeat rebellions in Ireland, he invited Scottish settlers to come and settle the Emerald Island. So we have Cromwell to blame for the conflict between Protestant settlers and native Irish Catholics that has created problems to this day. In my view, that's really the beginning of Britain's imperial future. The Glorious Revolution, which occurred in 1688, was another episode in which the British rose up against their king because he was Catholic, James II, and they invited William, the leader of the Netherlands, who was a Protestant, to come and become the new king of England. The Glorious Revolution was called glorious because the British felt that they weren't really changing that much, they were just setting things straight. And so inviting William and Mary to come and become King and Queen of England, British saw that as a glorious restoration of the proper Protestant balance in their country. Where did Britain's global imperial reign really start? I think we have to go back to Cromwell and the conquest of Ireland and see that's the beginning of Britain as an imperial power. Harrison Jodite says, was January 6th an attempted revolution? In some ways, I kind of see January 6th as being like the storming of the Bastille in the French Revolution. In 1789, citizens in Paris were worried that the government was going to let them down. So the people of Paris organized themselves and said, we're going to send a message. We're going to storm this citadel, the armory at the Bastille, and they stormed it, managed to knock down the doors and kill the people who were inside. Now, the people who protested on January 6th, they shouted, "Hang Mike Pence." Would they have actually done it if they had found him? We don't know, but they were certainly shouting their intent to execute their enemies. In many ways, January 6th, yes, it was kind of a revolutionary insurrection. By itself, that doesn't constitute a revolution. But could it someday be seen as the opening stages or the opening blow of change in America's government? That could certainly be. It's Me poses this question. To what extent did the Cultural Revolution destroy Chinese culture? China was really committed under Mao to really drive out any older or foreign influences. And so for a decade or more, China's so-called feudal past, the Confucian and Buddhist eras, were condemned. And communism was supposed to start a new day. Mao tried to destroy all kinds of foreign elements, not only the classical Chinese past, but also elements of Western culture. During the Cultural Revolution, professors were beaten if they taught modern Western physics or classical music. Students were encouraged to attack their teachers, workers to attack their managers. But the result of all that was chaos. The army eventually had to step in and stop it. So even though Mao tried to create his ideal fantasy of a permanent revolution, it just didn't work in practice. What China went back to, especially under Deng Xiaoping, was the business of making things, building an economy, and going back to traditional Chinese beliefs in a moral government, Confucian ideal of the importance of family. Those things were very deeply rooted in China, and Mao was not able to destroy them. America Papa Bear asks, so was the Iranian Revolution a product of the West invasion? The West didn't really invade Iran. It is true that in the 1950s, the CIA helped overthrow the government of the Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh and install Reza Pahlavi as the Shah of Iran. That CIA action did, in the long run, help contribute to the Iranian Islamic Revolution. Now, it did so because Mossadegh was fairly popular, and he was standing up for Iran's right to control its oil revenues, which were being increasingly taken by American and British companies. But of course, the Americans wanted to continue to benefit from that, so they saw Mossadegh and his nationalism as a threat, and they worked to undermine him and bring in the new Shah, the son of the previous ruler. He ruled as a kind of pro-Western secular leader. He managed to alienate almost everyone else in Iran. He made enemies out of the Shia clergy. He attacked the traditional merchants of the bazaar. He fought with unions of oil workers who demanded higher wages. And he kind of neglected the large numbers of peasants that were moving from the Iranian countryside to the cities, where they were increasingly recruited and socialized by the mosques and religious leaders. Now, the Shah remained in control through most of the 60s and 70s, but by the late 70s, he was growing ill. He'd become a bit more arbitrary. His children were acting more corruptly, and many people in Iran started to see the Shah as a source of more problems than benefits. They saw him as responsible for really terrible inflation, for excluding the professional middle class from the government and treating them more as subjects than as citizens. So as the Shah became more and more out of touch with his own society, the Ayatollahs were able to recruit more and more people into protesting, and they saw the Shah and his connections to the West as the enemy. So I don't think you'd say the Iranian Revolution is a result of Western invasion, but certainly it was targeting Western influence, Western meddling, corruption that was tolerated by the West, and all of those elements helped mobilize people and bring about the revolution. Collective 1985 wants to know, what were the bloodiest revolutions in the history of mankind that everybody seemed to forget about? Well, most revolutions are pretty famous, but there actually is one that's surprisingly unknown. That's the Taiping Rebellion that took place in China from 1850 to 1864. That uprising was led by a kind of delusional young man who started reading the Christian Bible and having dreams in which Jesus spoke to him and told him that he was destined to lead China into a new world in which men and women would be equal. Now you'd say, wow, that's strange. How could such a person lead a revolution in such a different culture as China? Well, by the middle of the 19th century, a lot of Chinese felt that the old imperial system had become rickety and rotten. Eventually, hundreds of millions across China joined the Taiping banner, and in the civil wars that ensued, 20 or 30 million people were killed. It was actually the bloodiest revolution of all time. And yet, it's kind of unknown because in the years that followed, the Chinese Empire restored order, and so the revolution that we remember in China, that's the communist revolution that gave us the China we have today. G-Radio Rockstar asks, how did the Arab Spring start again? Well, the Arab Spring, a series of rebellions in the major Arab countries of North Africa and the Middle East, started in Tunisia, where the dictatorship of Ben Ali had become increasingly corrupt. One fruit vendor was constantly shut down by the police. In despair, he set himself on fire. His action was caught on camera and then seen all across Tunisia and the Middle East. And that act of despair and protest resonated with millions of people who were struggling. Protests started in Tunisia. They spread from the countryside to the capital of Tunis. Ben Ali fled. And thus the Tunisian peaceful popular revolution took over. Now, when that happened, a lot of people said, oh, well, Tunisia's unusual. You know, it's a small state. It has an unusually large, westernized, professional population. People in Egypt said, if Tunisia can do that, why can't we? And so a small protest that was planned for Police Day turned into an unexpectedly large citywide protest as tens and tens of thousands of people joined the protesters. The government tried to suppress them, of course, and it was, back and forth. But then the Muslim Brotherhood, a large underground protest organization, they decided, hey, this is our opportunity. We should join the protesters. And at that point, everything came down to the military. Was Egypt's army, which was very large, very professional, very effective, were they going to be employed to put down the protests in the capital city of Cairo? Well, certainly the government ordered them to do so. But they were reluctant. And so the army felt, we have a special role to play here. And, we're not crazy with how Hosni Mubarak is running Egypt. So the military stood aside. They enabled the protests to go on, even at some point defending the protesters in Tahrir Square. Eventually, Hosni Mubarak resigned, and so the Egyptian revolution was also successful. Unfortunately, not everything went smoothly. In Libya, the revolution devolved into civil war. Same thing happened in Yemen and Syria. The Arab Spring began with a kind of common foundation of long-lived, increasingly corrupt and distant rulers, populations who were angry about unemployment, about a lagging standard of living. And once protest was seen to be an effective way to create change, it spread from one country to the next. This is everything for today. I hope you learned something. This is Revolution Support.